Okay, and I'm pointing the microphone in the wrong spot, or the camera in the wrong spot too. How about that? So I'm gonna have to fix that. So anyway, I have been touring the countryside this week with Natalie Hodde, who is our global grant scholar to Scotland. She has knocked the socks off everybody that we've met with. We met with the Centennial Club yesterday morning at 7 in the morning. We met with the Edmund Club yesterday at noon, and they have just been really, really impressed with her and who she is and what she's accomplished and sort of where she's headed. And I even got to host her at my home 2 nights ago with a mountain of people from my daughter's in town from Kentucky, and she brought a bunch of friends with her, and the house was full. We had a great time. Natalie, come on up and share with us. And I don't think your microphone's up, so don't talk yet.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm so happy that I can be here today. Thank you for having me. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to just thank you all in person. This experience in Scotland, this degree has been so transformative and impactful for me, and I wouldn't have been able to study there had it not been for this scholarship. So I cannot say thank you enough for your generosity. So I am going to talk a little bit today about just what life in Scotland looked like, what my involvement with the Rotary there was like, and then a little bit more in detail about my actual studies, what I learned, how I'm hoping to use that now. So one of the questions that I've been asked over and over is why Edinburgh? And truthfully, when I was doing research into master's programs, I wasn't looking to go to Scotland in particular. I Googled something like best master's programs, environment, something along those lines. And this is the one that I felt like aligned the most with my interests and my goals. And it just happened to be in Scotland. So a little bit about my involvement with the Rotary. This is a photo of me and all the Rotary scholars for District 1020 at the conference. While I was in Scotland, I was hosted by a Rotary club, Curry Balerno, as well as presented to a couple of clubs across the district that are listed below. And then I just attended some other miscellaneous events. One of the main ones was their district conference. It was pretty early on to my time in Scotland. For all of us, it was our first Ceilidh, which is the equivalent to square dancing, but the Scottish version. So it was a lot of fun. The Rotarians pulled us onto the dance floor, taught us all the moves. And one thing we had been warned about in our orientation was to not try to keep up with the Scottish because they would be able to drink us under the table. And we saw that at the conference. It was so fun. Yeah, they put us to shame. These are just some photos from Scotland. One of the gardens, they had a big display set up at the beginning of the term. This photo on the bottom is me and one of the other Rotary scholars, Cassidy. She was hosted by South Queensferry, and they volunteered at the parade in their town every year, so we got to join them. We were in our very official Rotary vests. Lots of fun. Something I participated in and am still participating in, it'll wrap up at the end of March actually, was a fellowship with this organization that's based out of the UK, Christian Aid. They are a poverty eradication organization. And so I got to go to London. This is my cohort. We gathered for some trainings to get to know each other. And right now we're working on a resource that we will present at the end of the month. So that's been a really rewarding experience as well. Another thing I was involved in was 6 Degrees. I got to serve as the Internal Affairs Director of the Edinburgh branch. And this is a bit of a mouthful, but it is a pro bono student-led sustainability think tank and consultancy. So we had 30 to 40 members depending on the term, and we usually ran 3 to 5 projects. They really varied in the type of project and in where they were located, from a local Edinburgh community co-op to a geothermal energy company out of Germany. And so we were very multidisciplinary, and I learned a lot from everyone that I worked with. So that was also a really great opportunity. Just a couple more photos. My family got to visit me in September, so it was really fun to show them all of my favorite spots in Edinburgh. And then we got to go up to the Highlands and the Isle of Skye and explore some of that beautiful scenery. While I was in Scotland, in the fall, I worked at a hotel in the restaurant. So this is obviously from a lull in the restaurant since I'm taking photos in the mirror. But then in the spring, I got to transition to something that was a little bit more related to my interests and goals. I worked as a project administrator at the UK Center for Ecology and Hydrology. So I learned a ton there. And then this bottom picture is my flatmate, Lydia, and I spent 2 Thanksgivings in Edinburgh, and both years I hosted a Thanksgiving dinner. And both years I required all my guests to make a traditional Thanksgiving hand turkey. So this is our completed poster. I felt like if I was going to do right by them, sharing my culture with them, then they could not leave without this. So they all had to trace their hands, write what they were thankful for in the fingers, and then jazz it up and make it look like a turkey. So that was a lot of fun as well. So now just looking a little bit more at my actual program and what I studied, I got my MSc in Environment and Development. I forgot to say this at the beginning. I graduated from OSU in May 2021. I studied biosystems and agricultural engineering there and got my minor in entrepreneurship. And so I have long been interested in the water crisis. When I went to visit these other Rotary clubs in Scotland, I would present to them about why I was in Scotland and then about my area of focus, which is clean water sanitation and hygiene, and more specifically, the global water crisis. And so after my undergrad, I felt good that I had a solid foundation for the technical side of this issue, but of course it's not just a technical issue, it's a very people-centric issue. And so I wanted to do a degree that was a little bit more focused on the people side to better understand, how we design effective solutions. And so that was why I was drawn to this program. It was much more people-centric. I usually describe it as the intersection of environmental science and international development. So we were taking environmental issues such as water access and placing them in their social, economic, political, cultural context to better understand them. And so it was a very different type of thinking than I had done before. It really stretched my brain. This is a list of the courses that I took over the year, just to kind of give you an idea of what those looked like. Understanding environment and development, framework to assess food security, development principles and practices, political ecology, professional skills in environment and development, and then social movements in the environment. And so to kind of give you an idea of what these courses kind of look like, one of the skills that was really important that we developed was critical thinking. And so in 2 of my classes, we actually did the same exercise. Our lecturer put on the board the question, what is wilderness? And when they first put this up, I kind of rolled my eyes and I thought, this is a little bit dumb and silly, especially as we got into like 45 minutes of this, an hour of this. But as the discussion went on, I began to see a little bit more why we were having it in the first place, because though I kind of assumed we all knew what wilderness was, as it was going on, it became clear that we all had a little bit of a different interpretation and different understanding. So, to some people, wilderness was untouched land, like there were no fences, there were no buildings. Some people would say, it could still be wilderness if there's a cabin in it and someone's living, but, for the most part, it hasn't been altered. Some would say, yeah, you can graze cattle in the wilderness, and others would say, no, not if, that's too much human intervention. So we all had these different definitions. And while that distinction was interesting in and of itself, the significance of that was when we're all operating from a different understanding, how we then make decisions about the wilderness or the nature of the land that we're talking about, it's going to be different because we're all operating from a different assumption. So, how much access we think people should have to land, who should have access, what they can do on the land, how often they can do it. All these things are going to be different based on our understanding of what it is in the first place. So this was kind of an exercise they had us do to start working those muscles and get those wheels turning, to ask questions, to not make assumptions, to not overgeneralize, because, these are very sensitive problems and topics we're talking about. So if we want to have really effective, sustainable solutions, as much understanding as we can gain, the better. And this was really difficult for me. There was a steep learning curve. It was very different to engineering. In engineering, when you learn an equation, they don't tell you to interrogate what bias went into the equation. They tell you to remember it and remember it well. And so it definitely was a different way of thinking for me, but it was really beneficial as well. Okay, so as part of my program, I had to write a dissertation. So my courses finished up in April, and I then had 3 months to research and write my dissertation. And I ended up writing and researching about the relationship between people of faith and climate justice. This was of a personal interest to me as a Christian, and just from my own experience in Scotland and then at home in Texas or Oklahoma, I had noticed a difference in this relationship, and so I wanted to explore it a little bit more. This topic of climate justice was also interesting to me because I hadn't heard of it before I did my program. It was not a term I was familiar with, but then it seemed to be woven throughout all of my classes. It came up over and over. This photo that I have is just from working on my dissertation. I printed out all my research, cut it up into topics and themes, and was sorting it out on the floor. You can see I'm smiling, but it's kind of a sad smile. Definitely a stressful time, but I made it through, and so that was such an accomplishment for me. I definitely did more writing in the past year than I did in all 4 years of my undergrad combined. But anyway, back to climate justice. In case, like myself, you're not familiar with this term, I just have a little description. It's from the University of California. Climate justice recognizes the disproportionate impacts of climate change on low-income communities and communities of color around the world, the people and places least responsible for the problem. And then I have this other quote from Mary Robinson. She was the former president of Ireland and has been a big presence in advocating for climate justice. She said, "Climate justice puts the people and communities most vulnerable to climate impacts at its heart." And something that I think is really cool, if you look at the Rotary's areas of focus, they do the same thing. They put the people who are most vulnerable at its heart. These issues, education, global health, peace and conflict, they are all the result of this unequal distribution of burdens and benefits. And they're all exacerbated by climate change. So really they have the same mission, and that was a cool parallel that I noticed. So I have some examples of kind of how this relates to the global water crisis and my particular interest. These were some facts that I used in my presentation to the Rotaries in Scotland. They're pretty sobering facts, but I do think they illustrate this well. So 443 million school days are missed each year because of the global water crisis. So we see, as climate change exacerbates the global water crisis, it creates a greater barrier to education, something that we all know is essential. In the same vein, collectively, women spend around the world spend 200 million hours per day walking for water. So as global or climate change exacerbates the global water crisis, as water sources perhaps dry up, as they become polluted, women are having to walk further for water. This is, a greater risk to their physical safety. This is a loss of opportunity, time they could be spent pursuing education, income generating activities, things like that. One person dies every 37 seconds from a water-related illness. So this one is pretty self-explanatory. As water sources are polluted, as they're drying up and people have to look to more unsavory water sources, this risk of illness just goes up. So climate justice as a concept I thought was really interesting because it connects all these topics that have captured my heart, these issues that I, am very interested in and would like to see resolved or improved. And I think it's the same for Rotary as well. It connects all these topics that we all care about. And so that was kind of why I spent a little bit more time doing a deep dive into it for my dissertation to try to understand it better. So kind of looking forward, I think what I learned this year, it just further reinforced my interest in these topics and the urgency I feel to address them as a global community. We're just seeing they become more challenging. We're seeing more erratic weather, more conflict, and the importance of addressing it and providing the same opportunities is just increasing. So I'm hopeful that I will be able to dedicate my career to this work. I'm currently living in Austin, Texas. This is just a photo from graduation in Edinburgh in November, and then a photo of me and my dog in Austin. I'm living in Austin, Texas right now. I'm working at a civil engineering firm. It's a water resource engineering for more specifically. And so I am working on floodplain modeling and remediation. I'm working on creating hydraulic models to see how different areas will respond under different rainfall conditions, to see where flooding is bound to happen, and to then hopefully design solutions to prevent that. So it's a little bit of a different side of the water issue, but it's definitely providing some more insight. I've learned a ton in the 3 months that I've been there. And then ultimately, I'm hopeful that I can kind of pivot and go back a little bit more to the water treatment side. You know, I'm in that stage of my career 3 months in where it's kind of getting the experience, building the knowledge still. But ultimately, I'd like to go back to this water treatment aspect a bit more. And as I finish up, this is my last slide. I just wanted to say thank you so much again. I will never be able to thank you enough. And thank you especially to Mr. Clark. I mean, I think he really championed this for me and certainly has had a major impact in my life. And so I just appreciate you, Mr. Clark, and all of you. So thank you.
Natalie, talk a little bit about, and you may have touched this a little bit already, but talk more about how you became interested in water and where you really want to be down the road.
I can't remember exactly when I became interested in water. Something that really developed my interest was I had the opportunity to intern at a nonprofit engineering firm out of Charleston that designs and implements safe water solutions in areas without access. One part of their model and practice that they emphasize is the sustainability of these solutions and community development. And so that was another driver for me choosing this program, because especially in water, which can seem like a very technical problem, you know, you see an area without it and you think, let's just run in, dig a well. They didn't have water, now they do, and it's great, problem solved. But in reality, that is rarely the case. The last statistic I read said that, you know, there were 60,000 defunct wells across Africa for a variety of reasons. Sometimes there wasn't the technical knowledge to fix and maintain it. Sometimes people just didn't want to use it. Perhaps there were, you know, local politics that were preventing certain parts of the community from having access to it. Sometimes the water, even though it was cleaner, it didn't make them feel as full as the polluted sedimenty water would make them feel, which doesn't, you know, we know that that is not the better alternative, but if you're food insecure and you don't have that conceptual knowledge of germs and virus, then that might be the water you choose. And so that's where this kind of placing these topics in their cultural context and things like that is really important. And so that experience, that internship experience really lit a fire under me as well. And so that's the kind of work that I would ultimately love to do. Like I said, I'm only 3 months in, so definitely in that stage of getting experience, building my knowledge to then be able to do that kind of work. Yes.
Do you know the book, The Worth of Water by Gary White
I do not.
and Matt Damon?
Uh-uh.
I would encourage you to,
Oh, yes, I do.
Matt Damon, the actor,
Mhm.
I'd encourage you to look at that, because if you haven't,
Uh-huh.
because it gives a solution to this issue that's been very successful, and
Mhm.
that's setting up with microloans, private businesses in these villages so that they take over with training, the maintenance that you're talking about on the operation. So anyway, but my question is, how many distilleries did you visit?
I actually, so when my dad and my mom came to visit in September, my dad is a whiskey aficionado. So we visited quite a few distilleries that week. I think that was the only time I visited any, and I visited 4 or 5. But I did often end up sliding my sample down the table to him because I don't have a refined enough taste palette for whiskey, I don't think. Yes. So during the World Cup, the Scottish would cheer for whoever was playing England. So even when England played the US, they cheered for the US. So I think their overall sentiment to them, to us as Americans, I mean, in, you know, real personal relationships, people were very friendly. But, you know, I think it's as long as you're not the English, you're all right. Any other questions? Yes.
Tell us about your research, your thesis. What did you write on? What was your topic?
So I looked specifically at the relationship between Christians and climate justice. Like I said, as a Christian myself, I just found it very personally interesting. And so I did my research through interviews. I interviewed 20 people maybe. And then of course did a lot of background research before that, journal articles, things like that.
So I was going to ask, did you find much background on that topic?
Yes, I did. It was not an area I had ever explored before. It kind of led me down the road of eco-theology, and there was far more resources about that than I had known. And it was a topic that's been written about quite a lot in the UK. A lot of the sources I read were UK scholars, and books were written by. Mhm.
You've given me a lot of new terms today.
Yes.
I've written down
No,
several.
that was on one of my very first days. I was in class. I was so struck by how many words I had never heard before. A lot of the people in my program had come from humanities background, so they were all nodding. They understood, they were tracking, and I had no idea what was going on. But you know, with time, I was able to kind of acquire some of the new vocabulary. Yeah, I did a little bit. I went to England for this conference. I made a good friend there who was Austrian, so I got to go visit her. Fortunately, in my undergrad, I did a semester abroad, and so I did more of my European traveling then. This time, it was a little bit more buckle down and yeah, buckle down and study. Yes. One of my main conclusions was just that compared to the UK, there was a lack of knowledge. I mean, because certainly there had been a lack of knowledge for me. I had never heard of this. And I found that most of the Americans that I interviewed were in the same boat, versus in the UK, they were familiar with the term and some of the concepts around it. So I really concluded just that there was a knowledge gap. We just weren't having the same discussions or had the same vocabulary about it. In Ireland. So I'm really drawn to the green places.
Just a question on language. After I left OSU, a few years later, I moved to Paris,
Mhm,
and I struggled a little bit with the language.
mhm,
And a farmhouse pledge brother of mine moved to Aberdeen,
mhm.
and I was, telling him, oh, I'm really struggling with day-to-day life. And he said, oh, it's worse for me. And I said, but how can it be? They speak English.
Uh-huh.
And he said, no, no, no. So what was it like for you in terms of just understanding English there?
Mhm. I found it mostly difficult to understand when I was at Rotary events, honestly. That was where I experienced the thickest accents. And so sometimes I would just be smiling and nodding, not really picking up much. Because Edinburgh too, as the capital city, is very diverse. So there were, all kinds of accents and things. I didn't experience the strongest Scottish accents there, but I think in the smaller towns in the countryside is where you get that, or up in the Highlands. Because up in the Highlands too, there are communities that speak almost primarily in Gaelic, and so that's where it gets a bit tough. There were certainly phrases I didn't know, but my flatmate was English, and so I would just come home every day and say, "What does this mean? What does this mean?" So. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.